I'm wishing for the one I love to find me today. Oh, hello there. I realized that I haven't done a princess profile in a while, so I thought it was time to make one. Now, my most requested princess at the moment that I have yet to do is Belle, and I have a perfect Belle cosplay outfit, but I did not bring it to Italy. So we're gonna do Snow White, or rather Snow White, which is just Belle trying to be Snow White. I don't know what happened, because I have that in my closet here, and then we will maybe do Belle next time or the next time after that. For those of you who are new to my princess profile series, which, well, me too, because this is only the second one, I do breakdowns of Disney princesses and their original stories, where we look at the princess through a neurodivergent lens. Now, as I've said before, sitting around and theorizing about somebody's neurotype, whether a real person or a fictional person, isn't necessarily the best thing to do, especially if you are neurotypical, but that being said, autistic and neurodivergent people did exist all throughout history before we had a term for it, and they are systematically erased from our historical narratives, what we know about historical figures, and the media at large. So in the same way that queer theory works to find hidden queer representation in history and media, that is what we are doing here. And at the same time giving a picture of autism that is more than just the cishet boy who likes math and trains, because I think we've all seen enough of that at this point. So, let us begin. If you are unfamiliar with the plot of Snow White, which honestly I realized whilst researching this video, same, here is the rundown. So Snow White is a 14-year-old orphan who is living with her stepmother, a very vain queen. The queen is afraid that Snow White will become more beautiful than her, and so she forces her to work as a maid and wear ugly clothing. And every day she asks her magic mirror, who is the fairest one of all? One day the mirror responds saying that Snow White is the fairest. That is also the day that Snow White sings the I'm Wishing song, and then the prince shows up and joins her at the well and sings it at the same time as her, and they begin to fall in love. Don't ask me about the logistics about that or about how she's just, 14, but we're just gonna ignore that. We're gonna move on. So anyway, the queen does not know how to deal with any of her emotions or insecurities in a proper manner, so she orders a huntsman to go kill Snow White and bring back her heart in a jeweled box. As you do. But the huntsman dude can't bring himself to kill her, so he just tells her to run into the forest forever. Along the way, she befriends a bunch of woodland creatures, as one does, and then they bring her to a little cottage deep in the woods. She assumes, since everything there is small, that it is a house for other orphaned children, and it was a mess. So she cleans it up, she cooks a meal, with the help of the forest creatures, of course, and then she takes a nap. And as I'm sure you already know, that was not a house for children, but for the 7 dwarves who work in a nearby diamond mine. So they hi-ho their way home, and then they are very alarmed at how clean their cottage is, and also the fact that there is a random child sleeping on their beds. She wakes up and she introduces herself, which is a hell of an introduction if you ask me, and they decide that she can stay as long as she cleans and cooks for them. And the vibes? Immaculate. But this magic mirror knows all things for reasons that can only be explained by magic, something that just fills every single plot hole ever, apparently. And it reveals to the queen that Snow White is not only alive, but that she is hiding in the forest with the dwarves. So she uses a potion to disguise herself as, and I quote, an old hag to deliver an apple to Snow White, which when she takes a bite will put her into sleeping death. So basically a coma, but she doesn't need life support, so she's breathing, but everybody thinks that she's dead or something. The logistics are wildly confusing, so let's just throw some magic on there, and that should be fine, I guess. So she bites the apple because she is a naive 14-year-old, which we can't really blame her for, and then she knocks out, and all the woodland animals run to find the dwarves. The next section of this plot is described so beautifully by the Wikipedia page that I shan't paraphrase. The dwarfs return with the animals as the queen leaves the cottage and give chase, trapping her on a cliff. She tries to roll a boulder onto them, but lightning strikes the cliff before she can do so, causing her to fall to her death. Which is fun, funky, and most certainly fresh. But even after the queen's death, Snow White is still vaguely comatose, I guess, is the best way to phrase that. And the dwarfs are 99% sure that she's dead, but they decide that they cannot bring themselves to bury her. So they put her in a glass coffin in a forest clearing, and they keep watch over her along with the forest friends. How does she breathe in this glass coffin? Well, we will never know, but magic. So anyway, she stays that way for a year, at which point the prince learns about her death and is very saddened, so then he goes to see her in the forest, and then for some reason he decides to kiss her, and then she comes back to life. I mean, on the plus side, she's 15 instead of 14 now, so that's like almost the age of consent, but overall not the vibe. Please don't go kissing dead people, even if they're not actually dead. It's to put it lightly, impolite. Then everybody rejoices, woohoo, she's alive, and then she goes to live with the prince in his castle. The end. Okay, now that we know the Disney-fied version, let's uncover the original story. Now, many people say that Snow White, or Schneewittchen, as the original story is titled, because German, was written by the Brothers Grimm. And it is true that the first written version of this story that we have is by the Brothers Grimm, but as we talked about in my All Disney Princesses Are Autistic video, which you can find, I need to learn the sides, whatever. The brothers were more collectors and compilers than they were the actual writers of fairy tales. Obviously, they edited and revised these stories, and the characters picked up a piece of them as they were transcribed, as any story and any character does, but the stories were not solely their own. They published the first written version of Snow White in 1812, but versions of it can be traced back as far as ancient Rome in oral traditions across genuinely every single continent and culture. Except maybe Antarctica. But honestly, the Snow White Wikipedia page is super in-depth about the traditional stories listed by culture, so I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested. So obviously this story has so many variations. We are going to go through the plot of the original Brothers Grimm tale, and then we're going to analyze that one in conjunction with the Disney one. Also, I might mention that the original version written down by the brothers was orated by the French sisters Jeanette and Amélie Hassenpflug, who lived near the brothers in Germany. So, this story begins with a queen wishing to have a child with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and then shortly after dies while giving birth to that child. Her husband, the king, because that's how kings and queens work, remarries a woman who is very, very beautiful, but also very vain and happens to practice witchcraft, as you do. She also has a magic mirror, which she asks every day, "Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" And the mirror always answers that she is the fairest. But just after Snow White turns 7, the mirror says that Snow White is in fact the fairest, not the stepmother. So she becomes more and more envious and hateful towards Snow White. Eventually, the queen cannot handle it anymore because, again, she does not know how to manage her emotions, so she orders a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest to be killed and bring back the girl's heart as proof, which she will consume to become immortal. I'm not quite sure how she knows that. Magic! Okay, moving on. So, the huntsman takes her into the forest but cannot bring himself to kill her, so he tells her of the queen's evil plan. And then Snow White cries, because she's like 7 years old, and says that she wishes to run away into the forest and to never return. The huntsman reluctantly agrees to spare her because she's a beautiful child and brings home the heart of an animal instead. She runs into the forest and finds a little house where no one is home, so she eats some of the food and drinks some of the wine, and then falls asleep in one of the beds. Also, instead of cleaning the house like in the Disney movie, she kind of leaves stuff a little chaotic. So, when the dwarves return home, they immediately know that there is an intruder. So they run around trying to figure out if anything has been stolen and try to figure out what's going on, and then they instead find Snow White, who wakes up and tells them what happened to her. They take pity on the child, and they decide to let her stay if she will be their maid and cook and clean for them. They also make her promise to stay safe and not let anybody in when she is home alone and they're at work in the mountains. Now they continue living like this for about 10 years, so let's say she's like 18-ish, sorta now, and then the queen once again asks her mirror who the fairest is. The answer is Snow White, and the mirror tells her that Snow White has been hiding with the dwarves. I do not know why the mirror took 10 years to figure this out or choose to tell her, but magic? Moving on. So the queen is obviously a lot mad, so she decides to take matters into her own hands and kill the girl herself. As you do. So first she dresses as an old peddler, and then she gives Snow White some silk lace bodices and then laces her in so tightly that she passes out. Luckily, the dwarves get home just in time and they loosen them in order to save her. The next time around, the evil queen comes to sell Snow White beautiful hair combs, and she combs her hair with a poisoned one, and again, Snow White is taken down, but then the dwarves arrive just in time to take it out of her hair. Does she learn her lesson? Nope, because the next time around, the queen dresses as a farmer's wife and offers Snow White a poisoned apple. Now, to be fair, this time around, Snow White is a little bit more hesitant to accept it, and so the queen decides to cut it in half, and then she eats the non-poisoned side. So Snow White trusts her and takes a bite, and down she goes. And the queen thinks that she has finally triumphed because Snow White looks pretty dead, so she goes on with her life, and then the dwarves are unable to revive her, and so they're also very convinced that she is probably pretty dead, and so they put her in a glass casket. And again, my question is, how does she breathe in this casket? But I guess magic or something? I have so many questions. But the next day, a random prince who is out hunting stumbles upon the casket. The article that I read used casket and coffin interchangeably here, but I'm pretty sure that these are two different things. Anyway, he hears about her story from the dwarves. They agree to let the prince take her back to her father's castle as her final resting place where she belongs. But along the way, and goodness, this plot point is not what you are expecting to happen, so let's just quote it directly, shall we? All of a sudden, while Snow White is being transported, one of the prince's servants trips and loses his balance. This dislodges the piece of the poisoned apple from Snow White's throat, magically reviving her. The prince is overjoyed with this miracle, and he declares his love for the now alive and well Snow White, who, surprised to meet him face to face, humbly accepts his marriage proposal. Which, wow. So the prince invites everyone in the land to their wedding, except the evil queen, of course, obviously. And the queen does not know about this, so she just continues on living her life, asking the mirror who is the most beautiful one of all, etc., etc., when one day the mirror responds that there is a girl who is about to be the prince's bride who is much fairer than the queen. So the queen decides to crash the wedding in order to investigate, because who dare be more beautiful than she? And obviously, when she sees who the bride is, she is oh so very, 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 very mad, so she tries to create some chaos and then kill Snow White again. But Snow White tells the prince what's going on, so he stops the whole thing, and then he forces the queen to wear a pair of red-hot iron slippers and dance in them until she drops dead. Once she's dead, the wedding continues. The end. How long does this take to kill someone? How did the prince have red-hot iron slippers just at the ready? Did the wedding happen with the queen's body still just laying there, or was it removed? Is it not unlucky to marry somebody right after her death has taken place? These are questions that will never, ever get answered. But I wish them to be. Anyway, that's the original story. So let's analyze some stuff. What are the autistic traits of this character, and how do they affect her actions and choices? Well, let's start with the autistic femme character trope that we've discussed time and time again. To combine those two tropes, we have a girl who is smart, quick-witted, and a go-getter who doesn't totally fit into social norms, but at the same time, people can't get mad at her because she is generic kind human who happens to be friends with anything and everything and is kind all the time, even to random animals. That's it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Okay, I'm kidding. But also, why do I put in all of this effort when I can just use that like 6-second clip to prove my point in every single video? I don't know. I think that the answer is that special interests are all-consuming and cannot be stopped no matter how redundant they may be. Help. Okay, but also the Brothers Grimm tales are usually more focused on using the main character as a catalyst for the moral to be learned, and therefore that character is, in a way, your Bella from Twilight or your Triss from Divergent, a character that has essentially no substance so that anybody can insert themselves into being that character in order to feel connected to the story. I'm not sure if that's their style of writing and or editing, or if that's how the story was originally created and told, but Snow White doesn't really have personality traits. And since she was Disney's first feature-length film, they didn't want to mess with the story too much, which is why they're very, very, very similar. And by messing with the story, they also didn't want to give her a strong personality. And then also like the whole feminism thing, it came out in the late 30s. We'll talk about Sleeping Beauty another time, but she's also a Brothers Grimm character, and her film came out 21 years after Snow White, and she only has 18 lines of dialogue in the entire film. So I'm not super surprised about this. But anyway, let's work with these small bits of personality that we have here. For example, Snow White is very naive and trusting. And we've talked about this before in relation to autistic people, but autistic people are more likely to see the best in people upon first meeting them. And we also don't always read intentions or social cues properly, so we are more likely to take things at complete and total face value and trust people that we don't know. Which is why we're typically the target of bullying and abuse and don't always realize it. And that's why Snow White is happy to receive the queen's gifts and just super chill about the princess's sudden proposal. It's also very clear both in the film and in the original story that Snow White doesn't have any friends. I mean, you would assume that as a princess, she would be surrounded by maids and other people who, want to be her friend constantly, but instead she's almost always alone, or when she's with people, it's typically with the misfit group, i.e. the dwarves living out by themselves in the middle of the forest. And even then, they're more like caring roommates than necessarily close friends. Her only true friends, at least in the film, are the forest animals, which, as somebody growing up autistic, I mean, animals understand sensory issues, they don't have hidden social rules, and they don't require verbal communication. So everything that they're trying to say is just very, very clear. Also, usually they are soft and they accept you as you are. So they are, in the majority of cases, millions of times better than friends that are humans ever are. It's not entirely clear to me if she's such a loner because she doesn't want to hang out with people or because everybody else is jealous and or doesn't understand her, but my point that she has no friends still stands. The last thing that I really have to go off of here is her chameleon-ness. The fact that she really has no personality actually tells us a lot. She can mold herself to any situation for survival. And that, friends, is our good old friend masking. Because I don't know about you, but I didn't have a personality until high school, at least. Because if you blend in, you can't be hated, and then you are safe because you are with the pack and they think you are one of them, even though you're not. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out my video on masking that is linked over here. One of the sides. But anyway, that's unfortunately really all that I have. That was a lot more anticlimactic than I expected it to be, and I'm just a wee bit sad about it, but I got to dress up and do a fun photo shoot, which is really fun, and researching princesses is still an absolute delight, so I think it is still a win. I hope that you enjoyed this and or learned something, and let me know what princess you would like to see next. Let me know if there's anything you think I missed with Snow White. I would really love to hear your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.